Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and today we're visiting with Christine Douglas Williams, author of The Challenge of Modernizing Islam. Reformers speak out and the obstacles they face. Christine, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a privilege. Thank
you. Christine is a 9-time international award-winning journalist and television producer. She's an appointed director with the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, an appointee to the Office of Religious Freedom as an external advisor. She also writes for Gatestone International Policy Council, at which she has served on the Board of Governors. Her writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Jewish Press, Breaking Israel News, Front Page Magazine, and the Hudson Institute, and many other news outlets. Christine, quite a lengthy list of credentials. Was this always your desire to become a journalist?
Things just happened. Things just unfolded for me, Rabbi. It had its beginning working in a Christian television station. I would say that Crossroads Christian Communications is the Canadian version of like CBN, because it's a national show. It's being aired. It's aired on global TV, and I did a secular show, a few of them actually, in that particular network. They had a CTS TV. It's now called Yes TV, and that's where it all began, at least in TV. Before that, in my younger days, I was a journalist, an investigative journalist, working for a radio station, on the beat news reporter. So I've always inquired and tried to get what was actually behind the story that we saw in the news.
Now, you were raised in a Christian home?
I was, yes. Okay. I was.
And you continue to pursue your faith actively?
Yes, actively. I would say as I got older, my faith became much deeper on a personal level.
In this world you lived in, there was kind of like this other world. And you're in Canada, which Canada is such an interesting dynamic for us in North America to contend with the South Mexico, which is contiguous to the United States, and then Canada, which is also contiguous to the United States. And looking at the changes between our good friend in Israel, the former prime minister, to the new prime minister that's following the footsteps of his father and friends with Oprah Winfrey and with Barbara Streisand and with this Trudeau reputation that kind of goes with it of like the celebrity prime.
Not to say, and awarded Omar Khadr $10.5 million.
Right. He's like the celebrity prime minister. You know, this is going back to his father's days when he was the celebrity prime minister. And Stephen Harper comes in and has a very clear policy of aligning himself with Israel and with Israeli support. And one of the greatest friends Israel has ever had in the role of Prime Minister of Canada. And we see this radical change going back to a much more inclusive, tolerant, and liberal philosophy of governance and of community building and relations, which truly becomes an extension of Europe.
Rabbi, I would say from my perspective, first of all, I came from the era of Stephen Harper. I'm a Harper appointee. And the Office of Religious Freedoms that I was advisor at, the Trudeau government shut down the Office of Religious Freedoms. I continue to work with the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, which has, it's the whole philosophy now with this government is very different. Now, from a point of view of partisanship, I try to maintain logic, fairness, equity, and I will say that there is a troubling pattern definitely going on in Canada as it stands now. Now, Canada prides itself as being a multicultural nation, and I look at it as, well, the U.S. is also very multicultural, but with a small m. Multiculturalism in Canada meaning enshrined by the Constitution. I realize that when it comes to free speech in Canada and the U.S., there are nuances, differences. I mean, we ascribe by the UN Declaration of Human Rights, just like you do. But with us, there is more of a stringent law when it comes to offending people, or maybe where that line of hate might be. And that ends up being quite the big problem happening in Canada now. I'm going to delve right into a very serious issue going on in Canada, and that is Bill M-103. It's an anti-Islamophobia motion that passed in court. Now, that word Islamophobia is something that has taken root in America. It's taken root in Europe. In fact, it's a global problem, I call it. It is very different than the word anti-Muslim bigotry, which I fully agree with. I don't believe in bigotry against anybody. In fact, today, we see more bigotry against Christians and Jews than anybody else. And in fact,
Absolutely.
according to stats, when it comes to race or heritage, it's Jews and blacks that are at the top of the ladder when it comes to hate crimes. But yet,
you know, T.D. Jakes made this statement, Christine. He said that the Messianic Jews like myself and the African American community share a ministry of suffering. We share this heritage of persecution and
Yes.
Hatred for our bloodline, our lineage. But the bottom line message is anti-Jewish is anti-Jesus. Anti-Israel is anti-Jesus.
But there's a drive now, though, to call Jesus Palestinian because he was born in Bethlehem, and Bethlehem is under the Palestinian territories, which is such a silly argument when we all know that he was from the house of David. But may I finish telling you about the Islamophobia and why it's so dangerous?
Yes.
It does not mean just anti-Muslim bigotry. It encompasses anti-Muslim bigotry, yes, but it goes further. It's a term that is pushed by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. It's a very dangerous term. It's a Trojan horse for the Sharia. Sharia under Islam is considered divine law where one does not question it. Now, according to that so-called divine law, it is blasphemy to criticize Muhammad, blasphemy to criticize Islam, and even when one looks at the history of Islam, it's based on the immutability of the decree, the official closed corpus you just don't question. So this word Islamophobia takes into consideration how hurtful it is to criticize Islam to Muslims. Therefore, you're breaking down the Muslim psyche by criticizing Islam. Therefore, it becomes so-called racist, bigoted, hence the word Islamophobia. But what it is a Trojan horse, because what it is doing subtly is imposing upon us a more tacit version of blasphemy laws where one can just continue with this kind of a strategy as we see happening throughout the West with a kind of infiltration that we see.
When you were doing your investigative reporting, is this what ignited the fire to take a look at Islam and really delve into this book?
That's a very good question. Yes, I'm investigative by nature. When 9/11 happened, I was working on a program, and this was a secular program again under the umbrella of the Crossroads Christian Communications, because in Canada we have something called the CRTC. It's a governing body that monitors all broadcast stations, and you have to have balanced programming even if you're under a Christian mandate as a station. And we had that balanced mandate, and I was one of the gatekeepers of that mandate. So I did a secular program where every religion was explored. It was an investigative show called Faith Journal. After 9/11, I was interviewing a Muslim from the Canadian Islamic Congress who was a bit avoidant when it came to answering questions about 9/11. And I detected there was an underlying, if you will, a kind of making excuses for it. Fast forward this a bit, we saw, it became some Jewish ploy, it became some American conspiracy, and it evolved from there. But he evaded certain questions which I thought were very straightforward. And while I expected this man to completely condemn 9/11 for its atrocity, he was subtly avoiding questions, but also somewhat making excuses for it. So that led me on more on an investigation. I did another program after that, which was a daily open line talk show, and we covered a range of issues. I got to know other Muslims. This was from the Muslim Canadian Congress at the time, and Tariq Fatah would come on a regular basis. I got to know Raheel Raza. These are Canadian moderates that are, in fact, Raheel Raza is in the book. And what I found was something very interesting, because they were saying things that nobody else was. They were saying things like, you guys have no idea what's being preached in mosques. It is being preached right under your nose. Hatred against the Jews, hatred against Christians. That was shocking at the time when they were telling us and educating us what was happening. And this was in complete contrast to some of the other Muslim voices that I was hearing. So I did more investigation and got to know these people and realized long before the investigative project, the Center for Security Policy, and other different security networks in the States started to do investigations on the hatred that was being preached in these mosques, they were coming forward and warning people about what was taking place, the Islamist incursion into the country. And it was sounding far-fetched, but they proved to be true. So that did take me more on an investigation until I decided eventually that, wait a minute here, we are a country based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Muslims are part of our country. They've been part of the Western world for centuries. And until fairly recently, we have not witnessed this aggressive form of Islamism that we're seeing. They lived relatively peaceful. So I realized there was a major turf war, a revival that was taking place in these Arab states and among the Islamic, the ulema and the Islamic despots. And there was a drive to take Islam back to the 7th century. This was Salafism, it was Wahhabism, but underneath that there was also a drive to bring it up to modernity according to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And these individuals that wanted to bring it in the direction as we are, they were respecting the UN Declaration of Human Rights. They wanted to live democratic, like a lot of them did before this aggressive form started to reveal itself, particularly after 9/11. So in keeping with religious freedoms, I figured, okay, it is their right to worship. In fact, it's anybody's right to worship what they want. They can worship a light bulb once they stay within the confines of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, respect the history of the land, and live in accordance and peaceably with everyone, and work with us to battle this beast that has now entered our country and is planting Trojan horses everywhere. And they're the ones speaking out against it. They're against this notion of Islamophobia. They all recognize Israel's right to exist. And that's, in short, what motivated my investigation and subsequent writing of this book.
Christine, as I hear you talking, I think a couple of parallel thoughts. First of all, you have what's called a landed immigrant status in Canada, which is different than what we have, where there was some under the British Empire that any former British protectorate, India, Pakistan, Great Britain, any who had citizenship in the realm could migrate to another, I want to call it affiliation, if you will, under the crown. This brought about a certain migration influx into Canada from other countries that had a strong base of Islamic population that brought that to Canada with them. And as we watch what happened in the Middle East, we watch what happened in Africa, we watch what happened in Europe, we saw that these conversations are the same conversations that were going on in France and Germany 15 years ago, where they said, we're not coming here to change things. We want to get along, we want to fill in. But when they went from 2% to 4%, there was a little bit more of a firming up of the dialogue. At 6%, there was an established identity, and at 8%, which is the tipping point, we look at statistically, we saw that that's where France fell, where London fell, where Germany's falling, where Hungary's put up a wall. This jihad by migration and immigration seems to be a pattern of repetition, that there are always moderates or modernizing voices out there in the early phases of this jihad by migration, immigration, which is peaceful, almost like the scriptures say that people want to hear their ears tickled. Is this somewhat of a tickling of the ears, a well-trained voice that is responding in a way that is appeasing?
Rabbi, a very important part of my book that I take very seriously is defining the difference. And it becomes a little politically incorrect, but it is what it is, and it's extensively researched.
Yes.
I define the difference between a moderate and a crypto moderate.
Okay.
One needs to understand that traditional Islam, of which Zuhdi Jasser openly calls in the book, these are extensive interviews, they're in depth.
Yes, they are.
Let me back up a bit here, just to give the character of these interviews. They're intense. They ask every person that was interviewed not just how they reconcile their faith with their quest for modernity and democracy and the fact that they're not even recognized as real Muslims because they ascribe to modernity and democracy. I discuss how they reconcile these problematic verses. They don't believe the ones that I interviewed in the Sunnah and the Hadiths, and that's their right. They have issues, of course. Some of them come right out and say, of course, it's painful for them to try to reconcile it, but they were extremely honest in their interviews, not just with their own human struggle, but also with what they espoused in terms of democracy. And that is the one feature that all of them agreed on right through, that they believe in human rights, they believe in democracy, they reject Islamism, they're warning about Islamism. Now, taking it to what we're seeing happening in across the West, Islam, traditional Islam, is Islamism. That is normative Islam. Zuhdi Jasser talks about that, and he calls it normative Islam, as well as, in his words, Islam needs tons of reform. It is an outright, do I dare say, bloody turf war going on in those nations because they want to keep the ulama powerful. They want their despots to continue ruling, and they're out for expansionism, as according to the major schools of jurisprudence. Every one of those schools, when you look at the Sunni, the Hanbali, the Hanafi, the Shafi'i, the Maliki, and you look at the Shia, which is basically the Jafari and the Zaydi, all of them ascribe to traditionalism, to traditional Islamic jurisprudence, which is expansionary. The Sharia is superior to anything, and you don't question it. So I am careful in that book to make it very clear that there's a difference between a crypto-moderate who poses like they're your friend and those who say, look, we are really on your side. And that was one of the basic purposes of the book, to be able to ask questions, to identify who your friends are and who your enemies are. The Holy Land Foundation trial turned up a whole list of Muslim organizations. It's terrifying who those organizations were, because they are the main organizations that claim to speak for Muslims. For example, CARE, the Islamic Society of North America, the Islamic Circle of North America, the North American Islamic Trust, the International Institute for Islamic Thought, the Muslim Student Associations. Virtually all of these major organizations were tied to Hamas / the Muslim Brotherhood. It is horrifying because I don't refer to them as genuine moderates. I refer to them in the book as crypto moderates. The people in that book do not ascribe to what these groups represent at all. In fact, every one of them believes in Israel's right to exist, and they all, for the least, believe that those Muslims who don't believe in Israel's right to exist, it at least represents Islamist sympathies. The vast majority believe more than that it represents that they are Islamists, because it's characteristic of Islamists. From the point of view of argument that you don't have to be a Muslim to recognize Israel's right to exist, yes, but at the same time, one need only look at history and the horrors of history and the brutal hatred and the antagonism against the Jewish people. I mean, going back in history, you look at the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. This guy didn't just work along with Hitler to destroy the Jews. This guy actually led the Arab revolt in Palestine, which was then really the Ottoman South Syria, from 1936 to 39. And he actually moved to ally with Hitler after leading that revolt to work against the Jews. And when Hitler wanted to send the Jews, expel them out of Berlin, he was the one that said, well, we don't want them in the Palestinian areas. Kill them, put them in the ovens. This is what we see happening historically. And then in 1935, the Muslim Brotherhood was founded by the brother of Hassan al-Banna, who founded the Muslim Brotherhood in the first place. So that Muslim Brotherhood was taken to what was called then Mandatory Palestine and established there. And that was actually the beginning of the kind of propaganda that we see with what we see today with the Palestinians. Raheel Raza, who was an interviewee in the book, she said, you go to Pakistan with a local guy that's ready to pick up arms and fight jihad and expansionism. He is ready to go to war for the Palestinians. And as she says, you ask him where Palestine area is on the map, he doesn't even know. He can't even show you. This is a propaganda that's been fueled against the Jewish people. So they're all in agreement that this is a litmus test, the attitude toward Israel's very right to exist, particularly considering that archaeological evidence has proven the historic roots of the Jews to that country. Whereas with the Palestinians, they come from the surrounding areas, from the Ottoman Empire, from Syria, from Jordan, from the entire surrounding area. There is no historic Palestinians, but there are the historic Jewish people. So they're all in agreement that Israel has a right to exist, and they're appalled at the Jew hatred that are seen among Islamists who pretend to be your friend, but you ask them openly, as Dr. Tawfiq Hamid says, openly, how do you feel about the Jewish people? Then put it up on your website. Talk about Zionism,
right.
Advocate Zionism. You won't see that with CARE and these other groups. And that's where they become busted when you put them to the test in public.
But these moderate, if you will, Muslims would be considered to be heretics.
Yes, they would. Yes, they would. They would be considered heretics by the ulama, by the hardcore Islamists, the Salafists, the Wahhabists. But we are living in a world today of 1.6 billion Muslims who are experiencing a turbulence within the community. We saw what happened with the Arab Spring. Yes, it was a grand failure. Yes, those youth are by and large Islamists, but it did show a discontent. It shows that there is a turbulence going on, and the turf war is more fierce than ever before. We've seen what happened with Erdogan. Erdogan is how you really pronounce it. Right. This man has gone from what appeared to be moderate, and he never was, but he appeared to be that way, to being a full-blown Islamist now, and an egotistical one. He doesn't try to hide anymore. In fact, he declared that within Europe, it's now a battle between the cross and the crescent. This is a vicious war that we're seeing here. In fact, according to traditional Islam, which is Islamism, there are two camps, two houses in the world. The house of war and the house of Islam, Dar al-Harb, Dar al-Islam. And it is the duty of every Muslim, according to the Muslim Brotherhood and according to the Salafists and the Wahhabis, to wage war with the infidel until it's brought under the house of Islam. This is a reality, but we do have a group of people historically that have been fighting to try to just be like everybody else, live like everybody else. Bernard Lewis, more than anyone, understands the threat of Islamism. This is this great historian, Bernard Lewis. And one thing that he notes is that Islam historically and culturally have brought comfort to millions of peaceful men and women that were not against the West. They just wanted to live in peace. But this turf war that we see, it has a violent indoctrination. The world is in a turbulent place today, which is ripe for an Islamist takeover, because what they're doing is that they're finding a lot of youth as well who are suffering with issues, and they take those youth and they say, look, we have a mission for you. You could be a glorified mujahideen. After you die, you're going to be a martyr. And this poor person goes right along with this, and they're feeling passionate about it. And before you know it, they're fighting along with either Al-Qaeda or ISIS. We live in a very dangerous world today. And from a point of view of the Christian church, they're the ones that need to be reaching out and being more relevant. They're terrified to discuss this very issue that I applaud you for being willing to take on today, because most churches won't touch it. Most churches won't go near it. And if I'm speaking, or a person like Robert Spencer, who's a Christian, is speaking, they turn their backs. I was invited even before this book and before the controversy of writing for Jihad Watch. I was invited to do a speech in Hamilton. And this Christian minister who calls himself a Zionist, he was so afraid, and I wasn't even as controversial then at all. I shouldn't even be regarded as controversial. Right. He ended up shutting me down. They had to go to the Hamilton Spectator, what's considered a leftist paper that accepted me to speak for them. Now this time around, they're not. So we have to find another speaking outlet somewhere else in October, me and another guy who advocates for free speech. But this is
what's so interesting about this is that the average person knows nothing about a shaheed. They know nothing about this martyrdom, that this becomes an intercessor on behalf of the family, that, we hear about the 72 virgins and all that stuff, but nobody gets down to the core of this, that this is an ideology that embraces the fact that if you are martyred, you have access directly to Allah, the God of Islam, not the God of Israel, not the God of heaven and earth, not the creator. In their minds, the creator of the universe, but yet this is a deception, and we see it as a statement of relativity. All throughout the Quran, everything is relative. Allah is greater. That's a relative term. Not that he's great on his own, but he's greater. That Muhammad is the only prophet. These are all relative terms in comparison to Judaism and Christianity, furthering this divide of comparison. And as you look through the Quran, as you look through the Hadith, if you look through the Sunnah, you see this relativity constantly comparing itself. You can become your own intercessor, and then you go before Allah and you petition on behalf of your family because your wife couldn't get there otherwise. Your children couldn't get there otherwise. They've done nothing to earn their way into heaven, so you petition. But nobody knows the result of that intercession.
Yes. When one looks at the Quran, it is a very interesting document. Dr. Daniel Pipe says something interesting. He would say you can take what you want out of that because there's so much in it. There are peaceful verses, there are violent verses. In fact, the Quran is basically broken up into two, the Meccan version and the Medina version. The Meccan version is peaceful, and you would find that genuine moderates, reformists, they get their inspiration from that. They have a history within Islam. Their families are Muslim. The moderates in general in the book came from families that were peaceful. They knew what it was to be oppressed by Islamists. That motivated them a lot on not wanting to have anything to do with Islamism. Dr. Tawfiq Hamid has a very interesting background where his father once showed him a picture of a Jewish man and his children who eventually ended up going into the ovens. And he said even though he had joined Al-Qaeda and worked with al-Zawahiri right at the top, there was always this nagging feeling within him that this wasn't right. In fact, he says today that his greatest inspiration has been Jesus reading the Bible. And on the other hand, he feels with what the Jews went through in the Holocaust. In fact, that haunted him, that picture of this man and his children while he was Al-Qaeda, until he just couldn't take it anymore. And now he refers to himself as having a very Jewish and Christian heart because he's very inspired by those faiths. But he also had a father who showed him the suffering of the Jewish people. And this man was also a Muslim. Likewise, Sheikh Subi Mansour, who was the founder of the Quranist sect in Egypt, a very kind man who actually worked in Al-Azhar University. And this is the center of all Islamic jurisprudence. He was eventually kicked out of Al-Azhar, eventually thrown in jail by Mubarak and exiled. When he came to Boston to pray at mosque, he was horrified what he saw. He saw the same, as he said, the soldiers of dictators and their language was right there at that Boston mosque, and he was horrified. He had to get out of there as fast as he can, and he realized it had arrived on American soil. He and the Quranist sect have been pushing for human rights and reform throughout the ages. And while we could say, yes, well, then you're not a real Muslim, well, the point is, who is a real Muslim? Because if you look at the history of the Quran, for instance, Robert Spencer wrote a book, Did Muhammad Exist? And based on what he turned up, one can argue no. And on the other hand, you look at the Arab intellects from the Al-Musliya website, and these are Arab intellects that are still Arabs, and they still believe what they say. Look, when one looks historically, there was a 200-year gap from the verbal tradition to the written tradition, and one need only, most kids have done this exercise in school, where somebody starts a story at the beginning of the line. By the time it reaches the end of the line, it's a completely different story. You're looking at 200 years where you had the worst kinds of conquests going on, so that 200 years later, following these caliphates and these violent conquests, what do you think would have been put into the hadiths and the sunnah? Some of it might have maintained itself, but others would have been twisted. And the Arab intellects say, look, this is just a composite of Christianity and Judaism with some of the violence thrown in. I mean, you have them criticizing the history. So from my point of view, one looks at the various histories of every religion, but what it comes down to is the human being that picks up that book and decides to practice it how they see fit. The Christian practices in peace because they worship the Prince of Peace. The Old Testament has words of war. Stonings are not practiced by Jews today. Christians in the Middle Ages may have been inspired by that, so they went on conquest themselves, and they forced conversions of Jews. It was horrific, and they did it to Muslims as well. So they have their sins in the past, but they've evolved. They don't do that anymore. Jews don't stone anymore. And while every religion is very different, humans deserve, and it's actually their right under human rights to practice their faith how they see fit. If they want to practice it in violence in their own country, that's their business. But for goodness sakes, we need to be more knowledgeable as to what we've welcomed in through the hijrah, through immigration policies, suicidal immigration policies, I call it. It is appalling that North America and Europe are largely based on Judeo-Christian democracies, but we are being completely eroded and infiltrated by forces that are doing what they intend to do. And the people that I've interviewed in the book, it's their human right to worship how they see fit. They generally don't go to mosque, and they say outright, look, this is something that you guys need to be forewarned about, and they've been warning about it long before American investigation started up on it.
But the average American, vocal average American, is tolerant, wants open borders, wants unfettered immigration policies, has no concept of the very verses that you examined within a certain continuity throughout your interviews of some verses that trouble each one of these that you interviewed. There were specific troubling verses. They're troubling for me, which begs a question: can you separate Sharia, which is a legal, civil structure of laws, ordinances, and compliance, which no other religion has that attribute of having a legal system? Is Islam a religion, or is it an ideology that has a component factor of civil law to it?
It is both, Rabbi. It is both. When one goes back to the beginnings of the Old Testament and the stringent rules that Jews are required to live under Jewish law, that was also legal. Jews just don't do that anymore. It is the human soul that practices a faith, whatever that faith may be. When a person comes up and says, look, I have a history where I have gotten inspiration from my friends, from my family. This has been our history for generations, and we have practiced in peace. We want to continue because we're inspired by this. Under religious freedoms, you can't say you can't, but you must abide by the law. When one looks at what happened with the Ottoman Empire, yes, when it fell and it became secular Turkey, it was still Islamic. But the political part of it was dissolved in the sense that it was no longer the Ottoman Empire. It had become the new secular republic of Turkey. And that movement, again, was pushed by the Young Turks and by revolutionary Mustafa Ataturk. He was the founder of the secular state of Turkey. You look at a country, the largest Muslim country in the world, Indonesia. They have been practicing moderate Islam for an awfully long time, but recently they've become more Islamized. These thugs, these Islamist thugs, the Salafists, the Wahhabists, they're our worst enemies. It doesn't do us good to try to reject the very Muslims that are saying, we want to be your friends. We're trying to help. We're trying to fight for our democracy, because when we were back home, in fact, I'll give you one example. I had an argument with a genuine moderate lady who was saying she doesn't believe in the hijab at all. I'm saying, I'm sorry, but you're on Western soil and we have to keep our values. I don't believe in the face covering because it is against security, and we work on the notion that we can see your face. But to say that you're going to ban just the head covering, well, what are you going to do next? Go ban nuns for wearing a head covering? You can't do that. We have to keep true to our Constitution and our religious freedoms. And if we had kept our eye on that, a laser sharp view of what that Constitution means. It means the end of FGM for Muslim women. It means the end of beatings that are sanctioned in the Quran. It means the end of all kinds of oppressions that we see that are commanded according to the Islamic jurisprudence. Because the modernized movement just wants to live in peace with Hindus, with Christians, with Jews, with Buddhists, with everybody else.
This idea of violence, Hamas in the Hebrew, which most people don't know that is a Hebrew word for violence, that there are specific instructions within the Quran for perpetrating violence. Now, there's a concept of infiltration that is bandied around. I'd like you to comment on it, the word taqiyya. And this ideal that it's okay for a Muslim to lie to you because you're not a Muslim, therefore the command of thou shalt not lie or bear false witness applies, but that's to a fellow Muslim. That anybody outside the circle of Islam, that to advance the cause of Sharia, you may manipulate or do whatever is necessary to be able to penetrate. Is this an accurate description of this concept?
Yes, it is. And I get that question all the time. How could you trust any Muslim with that? And here's my answer. When one looks, for example, at the Obama administration, the signing of the Iranian deal, the release of $100 billion back into the coffers of Iran to fund all of its evil proxies against Israel, against human rights, even against the West, because they have their thugs all through the West spying. It's not just Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is blamed all the time for funding mosques, which is very true, and exporting Wahhabi ideology and Salafism. But Iran is no more innocent, just as evil, because they're also exporting their doctrines, and they have their spies in every nation infiltrating. So when one looks at taqiyya, you look at a guy like Obama. What does he practice all the time? You look at politicians. They lie to you all the time. You look at human nature. Humans lie to attain what they want to attain. And when you look at Muslims out for conquest, the Islamists, of course they're going to lie to you. And then the question comes, well, then how do you know who you can trust? I say, look, this is how you know. You don't know. So what you do instead is that you keep, for anybody you don't know who's lying to you. And that goes to every area in life. So what you do is that you keep a laser focus on the Constitution. You do not allow Trojan horses like Islamophobia to come into your country, to shut down free speech, to make you live in fear, to actually be threatening you with expansion from everywhere. The Muslim Brotherhood already explained in a document that they were coming for the West and they were out to conquer North America. They explained it in detail. They explained it in detail in the project that was uncovered in the Al-Qaeda Maghreb. ISIS has come right out and said all the reasons they hate the West, but most of all, we hate you because you're unbelievers. Al-Qaeda has done the same. What more does the West need to hear? They hate us, they're expanding, they're coming after us, and they're making good on their promise. So the way you do it is you stand, not you, the royal you stand up for your Judeo-Christian democracy, your freedoms, your rights, because what they're doing is that they're putting us in a position of a checkmate. They're making us fearful by all of these global jihadi attacks of people who even criticize Islam and just plain attacks on innocents and crowds. ISIS has even issued warnings for their Muslim people to stay away from big crowds because they intend to be attacking on special days. They have put that sense of fear into the infidel because it was commanded to cast terror into the infidel, so that when people become justifiably afraid, what do they tell you? You have a phobia. So no matter what you do, they put that fear into you, and then they tell you you have a phobia because they're trying to shut you down from criticizing Islam. They're trying to beat you down into the ground, weaken you, exhaust you inch by inch by inch, to the point where the public doesn't even care anymore. They take our freedoms for granted. So they're happy. They're smiling their way with taqiyya all the way up to the highest levels of government, who opens the door and escorts them in. How could you blame them? They said they were going to do what they were going to do. Blame the leaders who are allowing this to happen, who are betraying their electorates and betraying those who actually trust them to look after their well-being economically as well as politically and look after their safety. They're abandoning all of the above. I'm not saying to be cruel to refugees. There are people in need. And I talk regularly to an Iranian lady that actually works in a settlement area, a settlement agency. And she says that you have a lot of very loving Muslims that are very happy to get away from that. And some of them come up to her and say, Miss, you don't know what's happening here. Some of these people that came from my country, they're talking in the hallways in their language on how they're going to overtake us. And she's telling me this. So you've got a mix of those who want to overtake and those who are in genuine need. And it's up to leaders to be careful who they allow in, how many they allow in, and why are they not more dedicated to helping the Christians that are suffering a double kind of persecution in these countries.
Christine, what I've noticed is that they go after the disenfranchised first. They go on to areas of poverty and into prisons, and this is their recruiting ground. And when you think about who you're recruiting in prison, you're talking about individuals that are looking for a cause, they're looking to aggress, they're looking to take out on society, modern day society, of the norms and work outside the purview of the law by adhering to a different set of laws that allow for their violent agenda to be fed. And so we see this growing prison population of people who are eligible for parole. They're finishing out their sentences and will be re-assimilated back into society, but as practicing Muslims. This concerns me greatly, to look at how the disenfranchised find themselves being recruited to be a part of a larger body. This was how Christianity was to go to the poor, the widow, the homeless, and provide that kind of support. And did we leave a void because we became mega churches and we became so Protestant about so many things?
Market savvy.
You know,
it is very sad. You have every reason to be beyond concerned because you're looking at several layers of recruitment. Those who are disenfranchised, poor. You look at the Nation of Islam. You look at the kind of language they're teaching the poor, downtrodden blacks in the States, that the police hate you, that white America hate you, that Nation of Islam, we're there for you, we love you. When the sad reality is they're still holding slaves in Sudan and Mauritania,
yes,
where blacks are being crushed and facing the worst kinds of discrimination. So they're lying to their people, keeping their people poor because they benefit from that. And what they're doing is that on that end of this black movement of the Nation of Islam, they're recruiting the poor blacks against what they call white society. And they're not even recognizing that multicultural society, and I use the word multicultural in the sense of every culture also exists, but they have turned it into a battle against white Christians and white Jews, and that's basically what it is. As one of my interviewees points out, Dr. Tawfiq Ahmed, in China, Muslims have no rights, but they don't care about that. All they care about are the Christians and the Jews, because for them it's a holy war against Christianity and Judaism, as much as they try to say they're the people of the book. The people of the book were paying the jizya tax to begin with.
Right.
But the point is, there's that line of recruitment from jails. There are also people that are leaving to fight with the Mujahideen abroad with ISIS, and they're coming back into the country, in and out of Western borders. That is scary stuff. So you're looking at recruitment, you're looking at the mix of violent jihad among many streams, and you're also looking at the stealth jihadists that we see in the country that are linked up to the Muslim Brotherhood, and nothing is being done about it. We are being slowly overtaken by population, by birth rate, and by plain intimidation. We can't even criticize Islam anymore without risking our lives. And this is a process that's been slow, and we've been beaten down. And I don't know what the future holds, short of a miracle, because it's a terrifying picture that's happening. And the moderates that are trying to work with us, they're facing the same, because they know what's happening in their country and they're seeing it happen here. So many of them are more frustrated than we are because they get it from all sides. They're hated by their own Muslim people. They're under death threats, death fatwas for abandoning the Wahhabi message, and at the same time they're being called, you're Muslims, you're dangerous, you're practicing taqiyya. So they're getting it from all sides.
Christine, as parents, we raise our children and tell them, we're not upset with you, it's your behavior. You as a person, I love you, but it's this particular behavior. From a Judeo-Christian perspective, we love all people. It's their behavior. It's looking at the fruit of a poison tree.
Very well said.
And this message of Islamophobia, no, I'm critical of your behavior. I'm critical of the lack of protest for bombings in Israel. Where's the outrage? If you are a peaceful group of people, where is the outrage? Why aren't you on television? You'll show up for the San Bernardino shooting. The night of the shooting, CARE will show up to defend and say that here's his brother-in-law. Go tell them what a fine young man this is. Tell them what a wonderful person this is. He just killed all those people in San Bernardino. His wife was recruited, he was recruited, and they perpetrated this murder, and I believe it was 13 or 16 lives, I forget the number of it, and CARE is out there advancing the cause of peaceful Islam. You judge a tree by its fruit.
Yes.
You don't
and
judge it by its
victimology card. It's a subterfuge, it's a Trojan horse.
And this political agenda of propaganda is getting an uninformed public to rally in support of open borders, rally in support of relinquishing vetting processes, that you'll take all of the 11 or 13 million undocumented immigrants here in America and give them citizenship. Listen, my family, firsthand, all went through immigration and naturalization at Ellis Island.
Yes.
1934. Fleeing from Hungary to avoid the communists that came in 1935. The precursor to World War II and to the Holocaust and to the rise of Adolf Hitler. The sentiment, the alignment between what was the country of Persia and the Hitler regime caused a change in the name of Persia to Iran.
Yes.
And of course, you know what that means in Arabic, Aryan. And so this was the ethnic cleansing agenda that's still going on. This is the underlying theme of Islam, is to drive for everyone to be under Sharia.
Yes, it is. To conquer the house of war. That is what the agenda is. And we have the fight of our life on our hands, and we need to all be combining together. One thing about the West is that historically, and this includes the church, we have taken far too much for granted in terms of our peaceful existence, our freedoms. People have gone before us, and they have suffered a lot. They fought Nazism. We have taken so much for granted that we go to work, we come home, we enjoy TV, we don't know what it is to be persecuted. We have our persecuted Christians overseas that are slaughtered, suffering the worst kinds of abuses. How much care have we really had in the churches? Do you really see people caring about the persecuted church? No, we're hearing horrible justifications like, oh, the Lord is using that and the church is expanding. How would they like if some criminal were to come through their house and kill their wife and right in front of them and murder their children and rape their children? Will they be so eager to say, oh, God is doing such a wonderful thing and he's expanding his kingdom by the slaughter of my family? No, they wouldn't. We have abandoned the church. And we think that somehow we're going to escape persecution. There are a lot of Christians that say today, oh, the rapture is going to happen, we're going to escape it. Well, we're not going to have a persecution. Well, hello, the persecution is already happening. It's happening overseas. And there's a world outside the US and Canada.
Exactly.
And we're not paying attention to that. And we have been sitting on our laurels for far too long. Now that we're being overtaken, we're like lazy individuals just sleeping away while my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Scripture talks about this. And we're just hallelujah, hallelujah praying. That's what Christians are doing. But they're not paying attention as to what has seeped in on the very soil that they were blessed by. They have rejected that blessing by not even bothering to look after it. Instead, they're condemning Muslims for trying to say, we want to help you, because
Right.
They're so busy putting their hand up, have faith, but no works. And they're not even interested in how to do the work or how to go about it or what is taking place or even to investigate what's happening. They're entitled and they've given up. In a large way, their faith has become it serves them a purpose. God has become their personal genies.
It's a pacifier.
And this is a sad thing.
It's a pacifier. It's a binky. It's something to grab a hold of, to find comfort in without looking with your eyes wide open. First of all, it was the great commission, not the great omission.
Yes.
We're supposed to preach the gospel to all four corners of the earth. That means in Malaysia, where a Christian has to register to live in Malaysia, you have to identify yourself to the government because it's 99.9 or 99% Muslim, but you can be a Christian, but you have to register. And you have to tell them of your travel plans and tell them when you're meeting somewhere. And this is
Rabbi, it would seem to me, because I know we have very little time
Yes.
left, and I have another show as well, but it would seem to me that their fear and rage and the detestation of Muslims in the church that I see a lot, not all, is greater than their faith in God and their understanding on what they stand on to be able to say, look, we need to stand up for our democracy, plain and simple. How many of these Christians are going out there and fighting these Trojan horses that are coming into the country? No.
Yes.
They're too busy rejecting all Muslims and sending out a message of hate and scorn rather than a message of caring and love, which is what they're supposed to do. I'm not saying to be naive, because you have Christians on the other side. They're just accepting Islamists left, right, and center, opening the door to any and everybody without any knowledge, without testing the spirits, without even knowing what's going on. That's the other extreme. But for those who have this hatred against Muslims, this anger, this rage, it's just not going to do, as Christians, any good without understanding and without increasing our awareness, our knowledge, and what is really happening under our roof to erode us.
You're spot on correct, Christine. We've got about a minute for you to wrap up. What can we do other than preaching the gospel and standing on a message of love, and that you don't have to die? One died for you. You don't have to become a shaheed. We have one, the greatest shaheed ever, the one who is the greatest intercessor, the only begotten Son. And the Quran says that God begets not.
I think you're doing it, Rabbi. I think you're doing it. The mere fact that you're investigating this, that you're interested in knowledge, to find out where the danger spots are, to be able to be interested in letting your light shine. Just because you let, Scripture talks clearly about not casting pearls before swine, yes, lest they turn and trample you. I'm not going to go out there with a bunch of angry dogs outside either, with a piece of meat and try to feed them. And I'm not comparing people to animals. That's not what I'm doing. Neither was Christ. He's saying, be careful, be sober, be vigilant. We have to increase in knowledge because we're being destroyed. We teach our children to be street savvy and stranger savvy. Why aren't we teaching the churches this? Sure. Why aren't we teaching this out there and letting our light shine and taking charge over this beast that we see before us, instead of kicking left, right, and center, throwing our arms up in complete incompetence, and basically on one side giving into it, and on the other side just rejecting all Muslims? Why aren't we standing up in authority and in knowledge to say, we have a land that is blessed, a Judeo-Christian democracy? That's what we need to be standing firmly on and not negotiating. When you want to rescue somebody that's drowning, many of them are in the Islamic world because of the torment the Muslim women suffer and so forth, even children. When you're trying to rescue a drowning person, you don't go in the water with them. You help them out of it in a careful manner. Why are we not taking charge over the situation? This is a human rights issue where Muslims stand to gain, where all of humanity stands to gain. We have evolved as a democracy, and we're allowing that democracy to be trashed by the likes of CARE, who keep on bringing up what we did, the accuser of the brethren in the past. That is long gone, while Muslims are still in these countries holding black slaves and oppressing women and cutting off people's heads and stoning people for blasphemy. We're not standing up for our beliefs here.
Christine, you are so laser focused with such a clear message and a clarion call for every believer to step it up. To step it up in your awareness, step it up in your knowledge, step it up in your understanding, and step it up in your calling to be able to answer that 1 Peter 3:15, to give a ready answer for the hope that's in you. We've been talking with Christine Douglas Williams. So fascinating, we did not take a break. We worked right through the break. Author of The Challenge of Modernizing Islam. Not only does this identify the challenge, but it tells you the heart of the matter, Israel. It tells you the heart of the matter as to why the concept of subjugation, the concept of conformity, the concept of uniformity is the agenda of Islam to make everybody the same. This was Adolf Hitler's agenda, was to dehumanize, to find ourselves an identity of a fascist community that was driving conformity, stripping an individual of their rights, stripping women of their rights, making women as chattel, which you've railed against for hundreds of years in America. You are becoming aware of it in the Middle East, where we're listened to, and into Saudi Arabia, into Pakistan, into Israel, into Jordan, and I'm talking to my friends right now in Syria, in Lebanon, who are watching this, in Turkey, who are watching this. Do not drink from the poisonous cup. Find out the truth. And the Word of God says, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Find out for yourselves. Ask for God to reveal Himself to you, as millions of Muslims throughout the world are having personal encounters with the Holy One of Israel, Jesus. We've been talking to Christine Douglas Williams, author of the new book, The Challenge of Modernizing Israel. Reformers speak out the obstacles they face. This is one of the best foundational reads I've ever seen that puts it in first-hand reporting and then summarizes it so that you can have the knowledge to apply it into your life and understanding of what's going on in the world around you. I strongly encourage you to get this. You can go to ignitingnation.com, click on Books and Media, scroll down, find it, click on it, and order your copy today. No matter where you are in the world, it'll take you to the Amazon portal for your country. I strongly encourage you to get it, read it, understand it, and open your eyes. You go to the eye doctor every year to check your vision. This is a vision check. This is an eye doctor for your soul. And I strongly encourage you to get it. Christine, what a pleasure and a joy it's been to meet with you.
Rabbi, anytime.
Thank you so much. God
and
bless you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
We're going to take a short break and bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth. We'll be right back.